Good afternoon. I'm Nick Cockler, the Andy and Bev Hansel Endowed Chair in Applied Healthcare Ethics and Regional Director at the Providence Center for Healthcare Ethics here in Portland, Oregon. We are broadcasting live from Providence St. Vincent Medical Center on Teams Live. You can earn continuing education credit for watching this event. An evaluation link will be sent to attendees following today's presentation. We will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the session, so please do submit your questions. This presentation is being recorded. Today's open forum is part of the 2021 Goldman Berlin Lectureship in Palliative Medicine, which is named for two Providence St. Vincent Medical Center physicians who distinguished themselves in excellent whole person care we now know as palliative care. This lectureship has been sustained through the years through the generous donations of friends of the Goldman Berlin families and of the Ethics Center. In the spirit of Providence, I'd like to begin by offering a reflection. This is a poem by Dr. Jamie Zhao, a palliative care physician. In palliative care, we are no strangers to the pain crisis or the dyspnoic crisis. In COVID times, we meet a new problem, the communication crisis or the connection crisis. Times like these, we are the only link between the two glass doors and the phone. Technology can do a lot, but we can never replace good old touch. In times like these, we meet strangers and become their caregivers. We become their family. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Sunita Puri. Dr. Puri is the medical director of the Palliative Medicine Service at Keck Hospital and Norris Cancer Center of the University of Southern California, where she also serves as chair of the Ethics Committee. Sunita is author of That Good Night, Life and Medicine in the 11th Hour, an acclaimed literary memoir examining her journey to the practice of palliative medicine and her quest to help patients and families redefine what it means to live and die well in the face of serious illness. Sunita received writing residencies at the McDowell Colony, UCross Foundation, and Mesa Refuge, and her book has been featured in The Atlantic, People Magazine, Book of the Week, NPR, PBS's Christian Anamapur show, The Guardian, Forbes, and Spirituality and Health, among other places. The recipient of the Rhodes Scholarship, her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Slate, and the Journal of the American Medical Association. In 2018, she was awarded the Etz Chaim Tree of Life Award from the USC School of Medicine, awarded annually to a member of the faculty who, in the eyes of the campus community, models and provides humanistic and compassionate care. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sunita Puri.
Hi, everybody. It is a real honor and pleasure to be here with you today. I'm not sure how many folks attended the morning grand rounds. This kind of experience or talk seeks to build on some themes that I talked about this morning, but is also sufficiently separate that if you weren't able to make it, you're totally okay. Next slide, please. I have no financial disclosures or conflict of interest. So what I'm hoping to do today is to kind of acknowledge and make space for the complex experience of practicing medicine, to examine how different writers use fiction and nonfiction to explore some of the things they have gone through, which are very human themes of love, loss, and grief. Things that I'm going to venture to say we do a good job of pushing away in patient care because we have to kind of keep ourselves together to keep seeing everyone we need to see. I really kind of want to offer writing as a tool to name, observe, and find meaning in our grief. And I'm focusing a bit on grief because of what this last year has brought, both for us as individuals and for us as caregivers. And I really I want to frame writing as a ritual in a year where we have been really stripped of rituals like weddings, funerals, things that kind of bring people together to work out complex emotions that maybe going to the page and to writing and to reading might be a way of working out how we've experienced not only this last year, but any number of tough situations in our lives and in the practice of medicine. Next slide, please. I wanted to open with a quote from a writer I admire very much, Joan Didion. "We tell ourselves stories in order to live. We look for the sermon in the suicide, for the moral or social lesson in the murder of 5. We interpret what we see, select the most workable of the multiple choices. We live entirely, especially if we are writers, by the imposition of a narrative line upon disparate images, by the ideas with which we have learned to freeze the shifting phantasmagoria, which is our actual experience." The reason I wanted to open with this quote is because it really kind of gets at so many things that we do as human beings and that we do when we're taking care of patients. We tell stories really to find meaning, is what she is saying here, and to make sense of the things that happen that are so overwhelming or incomprehensible, but we seek still to understand these events, to find a way of making peace with them. So I kind of think of telling stories as a way of making peace with a number of things. 1, with the events we see, but 2, with the fact that many times there will be no resolution to what we see around us. And in medicine, we're very, very concerned with solutions and resolutions. But what writing helps us to do is to become more comfortable with the things that we won't be able to explain, that we can't impose a narrative line upon, and how we make peace with the inexplicable. Next slide, please. So what is a story? There are many ways to answer this question, but essentially the way I think about it, and there are craft items to this in writing, characters, plot, how you develop both, the purpose of each voice in a story, the narrative line. But what I really want to help us focus on today is a story is not just recounting something that happened to you. It is the consciousness you bring to bear on what happened to you. So as Didion was kind of getting at, writing, "I lost a patient in the ICU," is not the same as explaining on the page what that did to you. If you've lost other patients before, what was it about this experience that was different? What is the resolution that you may be seeking, that you may not even be aware of when you start writing? So that's the difference between things that happened and the consciousness you bring to bear on what has happened. Next slide, please. So I wanted to kind of open with a story of my own. When I was a resident, I was on an overnight shift, and the way it worked was the daytime resident kind of set up a care plan for certain patients that came in during the shift change. And my charge was really just to carry out whatever had already been started. And there was a very strong feeling in my residency program about not changing things drastically, but rather supporting the plans that others had thoughtfully made. And the other charge was to keep them alive till the day team arrives. And so this patient came in with end-stage liver disease. He had peritonitis, his kidneys were failing, and my colleague had written orders to send him to the ICU to treat his failing kidneys and his infection. And when I looked through his chart, I saw that this situation was kind of an inevitable consequence of all the ways he had already suffered with liver failure, and he was not a transplant candidate. It also did not seem that he or his wife really knew the gravity of the situation, and my charge was clear. So I took care of him in the ICU at night, and as he worsened and worsened, I started to think to myself, what am I doing here? What is he doing here in the ICU? Where am I going with this? And I tried to talk to the family in the limited way I knew how to do back then, basically trying to paint a grim picture and hoping that they would then say to me, we understand and we just want him to be comfortable. But all I did was lay out the facts and not offer a path forward because I didn't know how to do that. And I offered options that I hoped they wouldn't take. And they took everything I offered. They wanted everything done. They wanted him to be a full code. And shortly after that meeting, he actually got much sicker quickly, had to be intubated, and very shortly after that, he arrested. And I led the effort of doing CPR on him for about 40 minutes. There was blood everywhere. His excrement was all over the floor. His face was bloated and blue. And I tried very hard not to look at his face because I couldn't reconcile what I was doing to this man with what I knew I should be doing instead. And he died that night. And I felt like a failure on multiple levels. But the biggest struggle for me was that I provided care that I did not think was in any way beneficial and was actually very harmful to him. And I didn't know how to express any of that. And I have lived with the memories of the code for a long time. For sometime I had nightmares about it. It really got under my skin. And so this was the story, one of the first stories that I had to allow myself to feel fully and put into words to deal with it. Next slide, please. I didn't realize at the time that part of what I was going through was actually grieving. It wasn't just being hard on myself. It wasn't just, asking for mentorship and how to handle these situations better. It was actually grieving my lack of preparation and the consequences of that for him and for his family. So grief is a reaction to profound loss. And as we know, it has multiple stages and emotional effects, but also physical, cognitive, and spiritual effects. It's a universal experience. And it's not just in our personal lives when we lose someone or something, or we're grieving our lack of direction in life, for example. It happens in our work, in our everyday, when we're taking care of people in high intensity situations, but we're not always given the space to work it out or to talk about it. And we're also not always able to label it for what it is. Next slide, please. Oh, it looks like this slide, unfortunately, is not projecting well. My apologies. The grief amidst COVID-19, which was on the prior slide, I do want to acknowledge this because I think that this is a situation that we had a really hard time coming to terms with, even though grief and loss were more in the national spotlight than they may have been in the past. For our medical staff, dealing with uncertainty, dealing with the possibility of rationing, the suffering and the death that they were going to witness, inadequacy and inability to stop this virus, or inability to even understand its ways early on, trying to keep a stiff upper lip, trying to keep things going when things were collapsing all around you. For patients and families, separation and inability to connect meaningfully with their loved ones, fears of contagion, and ongoing fear and uncertainty generally. among many other things. And I think for all of us, a loss of normalcy, economic hardship, lack of connection and safety, lack of ritual, and anticipatory and complicated grief were all things that I think many of us experienced. Next slide, please. I have certainly seen this in my practice where grief almost becomes an unspeakable thing because we don't always know how to name and to cope with it ourselves or when we're taking care of others. So Megan O'Rourke, who's the author of The Long Goodbye, which is a book I recommend to you, wrote, "In those first months, I quickly came to feel almost embarrassed by my sorrow. Most people are uncomfortable around loss. Friends talk to you about getting through it and moving on and healing. I think this is part of why there are so many memoirs and movies about loss. They create a space where we can talk safely about grief." Next slide, please. I don't know how many of you saw this photo when it made the rounds a few years ago, but this is a photo taken by a paramedic of an emergency room physician who was taking care of a badly injured patient that the paramedic brought in, and the patient died shortly after arrival. And the situation was a complicated one and the loss was a heavy one. And this physician went outside to grieve in this way. And I put this image up because I think many of us do this in our own ways. When there's not a space created to discuss it, even internally, to make that space to deal with our own emotions, but certainly not in our system of care. And to me, this image evoked a lot in me about the ways, for example, with my patient with liver disease, I did this same thing metaphorically, and how isolating that felt. Next slide, please. We also know from studies that physician grief is very real and has a very real impact on our lives and on patient care. In one study in 3 Canadian hospitals about a decade ago, 20 oncologists were interviewed and found that balancing grief and detachment did not work. When people lost their patients, feelings of failure and self-doubt and powerlessness really came up for them and bled into their other encounters with different patients. And a third of them talked about feelings of guilt, insomnia, and crying, amongst other things. Next slide, please. Grief in the medical context, I'm going to venture to say this is an experience many of you in the audience have had, but it's regarded as somewhat shameful and weak. And sometimes some people may consider it unprofessional. So we hide our grief. We compartmentalize. We try to do that so that we can move on to the next patient and hopefully try to get through our day. But what this results in is a type of grief called disenfranchised grief, which is when people experience grief that they incur from a loss that can't be openly acknowledged or mourned. And this is, I think, a very universal experience in medicine generally that became acutely worse over the past year when we were held up as heroes and people clapped for us at 8 o'clock. And what we really needed was a forum to acknowledge how hard this is for us. Next slide, please. So the impact of disenfranchised grief, withdrawing from patients as they become closer to dying, impact on personal lives, and the need really to normalize death and grief as part of life and medical practice really arose from this study and others. But there's few, if any, rituals for physicians to really process and explore their grief. There are a few in place, like debriefs after codes, M&Ms, Schwartz rounds, but I have found that these forums, while very helpful, are not sufficient on the individual level of processing what you see. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a bit about creative rituals, including the obvious, writing, which we're going to get to in a moment. I really like this quote from Elizabeth Gilbert in the book, Eat, Pray, Love. This is what rituals are for. We do spiritual ceremonies as human beings in order to create a safe resting place for our most complicated feelings of joy or trauma, so that we don't have to haul those feelings around with us forever, weighing us down. We all need places for ritual safekeeping. And rituals, I think, in medicine are very formalized rituals when it comes to patient care. But many of those, again, are focused on things like what could have gone differently? What can we do better? And on the individual level, how do you create space to get out of your mind, get your mind out of the way so that emotion can be processed in a way that is therapeutic? Next slide, please. I firmly believe that writing and literature can help. The last stage of grief that David Kessler kind of spoke to is this idea of meaning making. So we go through the stages and then we want to figure out, what did all of this mean? We know that writing in humanities can protect empathy in medical students, but the concept of self-empathy is not something that I don't ever remember talking about in medical school or residency or fellowship. There's a lot of talk about wellness and self-care, but those are very variably defined by people. And what does it mean to care for one's emotions incurred by a very difficult job? Writing letters, journaling, snapshots of days and scenes, even we write these down just as phrases, externalizing it is so therapeutic in and of itself. The beauty of writing and literature is that we're really kind of marrying the personal experience with a more universal experience. We've all gone through tremendous losses in our lives, and the expression of it and reading another's experience can actually help with that feeling of isolation and loneliness. And I've always wondered whether writing can become a ritual for care providers that we teach from medical school onwards. Next slide, please. So I want to return to Didion, who wrote really truly a masterful memoir called The Year of Magical Thinking, which kind of takes you through her experience of grief after the very sudden loss of her husband from a massive heart attack. This is the opening of her book. Life changes fast. Life changes in the instant. You sit down to dinner and life as you know it ends. The question of self-pity. This opens her book and she goes on to explain that these bullet points were all she could write for a period of time. And sometimes when something's churning inside us, it's the bullet points or the phrases or even a bunch of different words that pop up that are the first thing we write. And this is the place to start, because part of writing, as I mentioned earlier, is getting your rational mind out of the way. And we're so dependent on our rational mind and logic at work that part of this exercise is learning to rely on something beyond us, something like a creative energy that is often blocked in our training or trained out of us. Next slide, please. So this is where I'd like all of you to take a moment. I know people are probably eating lunch, but I tried to give you a bunch of slides in the beginning to let you eat. So hopefully this is a good point to participate. So let's look at Didion as a model and those phrases that she wrote down. Whatever comes to mind immediately is what I want you to write down. Write a series of phrases describing a person or situation either that you are grieving or struggling with or seek to memorialize in some way. Do not censor yourself. This is not the time to think about word choice or any of that. I just want you to set aside your rational mind and start writing phrases. And those who would be willing to share, we can do that in the Q&A and read a few of the responses. The other thing I want you to notice as you do this is what is coming up for you when you write these words. So I'm going to give you a couple minutes to do that. All right, so I'm wondering if we have any brave volunteers who want to share what phrases or thoughts they've written down.
Thanks, Dr. Puri. Kevin here. We do have a few entries thus far into the chat. I can go ahead and read those aloud, if that'd be helpful.
Certainly.
So one anonymous participant wrote, "I want to help that patient, that person, that human who is suffering. But the only control I have is to type things on a keyboard and see something happen on a screen."
Yes.
Lois Levine from Reed College writes, "Hurt, endangered, ignored, shaking with anger, but knowing anger is covering my sense of loss, hurt." One of our chaplains, Mira, writes, "It is so hard to see a family who is so attached to their loved one surviving that they can't allow themselves space to say goodbye to him before he's dead. I feel angry, frustrated, incredibly sad to see this needless suffering that is prolonged by their inability to accept what is happening."
Thank you so much to those of you who shared. I think it's very brave to do that in a forum like this. And I think what I'm hearing is a lot of raw emotion, which is exactly where you want to start if you're able to open yourself to that emotion. And that's where Didion started, with kind of some words, but trouble comprehending how to make sense of what she was feeling at first, and really a sense of powerlessness about what comes next. Next slide, please. When we first start writing things down, we're trying to understand the story we're telling ourselves. And that's the place where reflective writing can begin. So I want to share with you some of the things that I've heard when I did this talk. I think it was somewhere mid last year at our institution. He died from complications of a surgery I don't think he was strong enough to have. I didn't bring up my concerns to my attending. I am so regretful. It's from a surgery resident. 40 years old, lung cancer, ICU, chemo, sepsis, ventilator, and pressors. My age, kids, wife, dying from treatment I gave. I killed him. An oncologist. The COVID ICU is closed to most of us because of PPE shortages. I manage my patients on dialysis, but I can't examine or see them. This isn't what doctoring should be like, and I now dread being on service because family asks me about their loved ones, and sometimes I have no idea what their person even looks like." From a nephrology fellow. And no need to enter anything in the chat for this, but do you recognize yourself or some of your own longings and concerns and fears and frustrations in these words? And I wonder if those who offered their own words, whether others in the audience resonated with the themes they were getting at. And the reason I'm asking this question is because I venture to say what everyone here is saying and what these folks had said in my other talk are fairly similar and can make you feel a little less isolated in your own feelings. I know that when I went through that case in residency, I didn't feel like I could really talk about it with anybody. I didn't know how to process it. And it was only much later after residency ended where a colleague of mine and I had lunch, and he told me quite frankly about cases he'd gone through when we were co-residents but didn't have the chance to share for the same reasons. So writing it down can dispel or can open you to your emotions, but can also dispel the loneliness that you might feel when you connect with what others have written. Next slide, please. So I want to kind of make it clear that what we're trying to do here is to open you to the idea of writing as reflection. Writing a piece for publication is something that's kind of its own separate thing. And so this is really just an exercise in ritualizing a creative space for you. And by the way, this is how every piece of mine, everything I've ever written has started in this way. Don't think when you're doing this, just feel and let the words come. Write whatever you can in a sitting, whatever sitting might mean to you, 5 minutes or an hour, and let it be and come back to it. And allow yourself to feel what you feel when what you've written is done. Do you feel unburdened? Do you feel worse? What did it mean to you to put this on paper and externalize it? Keep moving forward. When you're writing, just keep going. Grammatical errors, anything, just don't worry about it. Keep going. Do not edit. Just let the writing be. Sometimes when I'm really stuck, I look for different formats in which to do this, whether it's a letter to a patient I lost or to someone I love who died and I couldn't be there, whether it's stream of consciousness, whether it's reading a phrase out of a book I love and building on what I take away from that. You are a character. How do you treat yourself on the page? That's something to notice when we're doing the reflective writing, because it's as much about the events we're processing as the lens we bring to the events that we're processing. Are you being hard on yourself? And is that just, the lens that you bring to most things? If a friend of yours wrote what you did, how might you respond and be supportive to them? And noticing how you're portraying yourself and your experience on the page is something else that we might get out of writing as reflection. Next slide, please. So my initial sentences because I did this, why did I code him for that long? Anger, rage, I feel it all, but at myself, I should have known better. I know being angry won't bring him back. I want a do-over and I won't have one. He's dead. Dead in the worst way because of me. Next slide, please. And I want to go back to Didion's next words after she wrote those phrases. Those were the first words I wrote after it happened. The computer dating on the Microsoft Word file reads May 20th, that was 2004, not the year 200, 11:11 p.m. But that would have been a case of my opening the file and reflexively pressing save when I closed it. I made no changes to that file in May. I had made no changes to that file since I wrote the words in January 2004, a day or two after the fact. For a long time, I wrote nothing else. What her opening to this book really shows is that you need time to bridge what happened and the extraction of meaning from it. And we know that kind of at a cerebral level, I think, but to actually experience that and the way she wrote about what needed to happen to tip her over into going from phrases to something that provided her at least a space to make peace with the lack of resolution of what had happened. That's the process I want you to notice here. That it takes time to go from the phrases in the initial writing to know what you're trying to say and to know what you're trying to get at for yourself. Next slide, please. I'm going to offer you here some phrases and thoughts from writers and texts that I admire and places that I've gone to when I've been stuck in my practice and not knowing how I feel. Try to live the questions themselves as if they were locked rooms or books written in a foreign language. Don't search for the answers which could not be given to you now because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. And that's from Rainer Maria Rilke from Letters to a Young Poet, which is another book I highly recommend. But living a question, why did I code him that long? What am I going to do to make peace with that? Living through that difficulty meant this question coming up when I took care of other patients that came after him and struggling in the same way, wanting to do better, wanting to live through the questions to find an answer. But after I wrote it down, at least the question was in my head, even though I had no resolution quite yet. Next slide, please. I want you to return to your sentences and ask yourself, what is a question that is waiting for an answer on your page? Or what is a statement that seeks resolution? And I'll give you a minute to think about that and ask folks to share if they're willing. So I'm wondering if anybody would be willing to share.
So Dr. Puri, I think folks may still be typing, but we do have some other comments that continue to trickle in from the previous prompt. Would you like me to share some of those while folks are working?
Yep.
Great. I am no one, suddenly. Suddenly, I am one. Can loneliness and independence coexist? My mom lay on the floor for 3 days before she was found. She made it, that time. But I find myself reminded of it when a patient is found in their own excrement, or someone keeps falling but refuses to move to a higher level of care. Low safety awareness, they called it, when the assisted living facility bounced her out. When I am resistant to work with someone who shows the same low safety awareness, am I reacting to them or to my mom again?
All so beautiful.
I wanted reconciliation, peace, collaboration. Didn't want to accuse anyone, but it's all gone wrong and turned into a legal battle. I feel a failure and that I've been forced into doing what goes against all I stand for. Aaron Metcalf shares, the word loss barely comes close. I don't know what could describe how deep the feelings go. Needing to flee this situation, why are my colleagues so calm?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Kevin.
And when I did bring up my concerns, my resident shut me down.
Yeah. So much emotion in what's being read, and I would add some beautiful writing that has been read in this time. So see what you can do even in a few minutes when you just let the floodgates open. I really want you to notice that, because what's being written here is profound, and a profoundly common set of experiences and reactions to things that we face as human beings and as care providers. One of you talked about the lack of language to really express what a loss has done. And I want you to notice that too, because we do come up against the limits of language when we're feeling something so indescribably deep and profound and earth-shattering that language fails us. And notice that too. Put blanks on the page when you don't know how to describe it, because if you come back to it, you might have a little language with which to pursue that description, but notice it. Next slide, please. This is another beautiful book that I think everybody should read. In A Grief Observed, C.S. Lewis really kind of shows us how reflection can follow the facts, how the resolution we're reaching for may still be out of reach, but reflection is possible. An odd byproduct of my loss is that I'm aware of being an embarrassment to everyone I meet. Some funk it altogether. R has been avoiding me for a week. Perhaps the bereaved ought to be isolated in special settlements like lepers. So reflecting on what how your place in the world gets altered as you move through a tough experience and its aftermath. Next slide, please. In Do No Harm, Henry Marsh in this passage really kind of brings up a tension that exists between the creative self and the medical self, and its each's relationship to uncertainty. Writing and the creative arts don't necessarily move away from uncertainty, but they move towards it and engaging with the fault lines in human experience. How will I move forward taking care of patients found in their own excrement when every time I see it, my mother comes up to me? There's never necessarily going to be a resolution to that, but it's in the lack of resolution that the beauty exists. Whereas in medicine, we're very uncomfortable with uncertainty. And I think we saw a lot of that over the past year, taking care of patients suffering from a disease that was mysterious. So he writes, few people outside medicine realize that what tortures doctors the most is uncertainty, rather than the fact that they often deal with people who are suffering or who are about to die. It is easy enough to let somebody die if one knows beyond doubt that they cannot be saved. If one is a decent doctor, one will be sympathetic, but the situation is clear. This is life, and we all have to die sooner or later. It is when I do not know for certain whether I can help or not, or should help or not, that things become difficult. Someone voiced in their reflection not being listened to by a superior. That too figures into this, that we are uncertain sometimes how to proceed and whether our knowledge is sufficient, but we're also uncertain when we work in a field with a power structure whether our voice can be heard, and the uncertainty about how to make it heard, if it's possible, and making peace when you don't think it is. Next slide, please. In The Sound of a Wild Snail Eating, Elizabeth Tova Bailey talks about what it meant for her to suffer from profound neurologic compromise and to learn lessons from a snail that was living next to her in a plant. When the body is rendered useless, the mind still runs like a bloodhound along well-worn trails of neurons, tracking the echoing questions, the confused family of whys, whats, and whens, and their impossibly distant kin, how. The search is exhaustive, the answers elusive. Sometimes my mind went blank and listless. At other times it was flooded with storms of thought, unspeakable sadness, and intolerable loss. What she's describing here is how what you start to write and the distance you seek from it kind of comes in waves, and I think of them as spasms. When you're meditating on a question or trying to reflect on something painful that has stirred you, there may be periods where nothing comes and these periods where everything comes. And those two are okay to coexist, especially when you're trying to reflect on something that may be beyond words. Having the periods where the words don't come and the periods where they come en masse are both part of what it means to move through whatever you're trying to process on the page. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip that one. Thank you. And when we talk about making meaning, which I just want to say that meaning is a shifting concept. What it might mean to seek resolution to what you've written today might be, you might have one thing in mind right now, but a few months from now, resolution and making meaning may look very, very different. So what we write now is kind of a reflection on how we feel about something that transpired, but in this moment in time. And meaning making takes time and it's shifting. Cheryl Strayed is a Portland-based author, one who I deeply admire, but I particularly admire her first book called Torch, which is a novel. Torch is the result of my first sustained effort at digging. When I scratched the surface as I wrote it, I came to understand that I didn't know what I was going to find as each layer revealed itself. It was only after I'd finished that I could see what I'd done. Written a novel not only about grief and loss, but also about love in its many forms, about how we find light in the midst of the most profound darkness, about how we survive what we think we will not. What you write today, you may come back to and have very different feelings about, or what you start to write and continue may lead you somewhere very unexpected. And that too is part of being brave and allowing what comes on the page to come. Next slide, please. So I wonder if you would be willing to return to the phrases and the sentences you wrote, and whether you might now build a bit on them to see if you can form a paragraph. So I'm going to give you a minute or so to do that, and then would be very grateful if anybody would be willing to share what they've built upon what they've already written.
Dr. Puri, Kevin here again. We have some comments that are in the chat from the previous conversation if we want to pivot to those while folks are still writing. Would you like to do that again?
That sounds great.
Great. So I think this is maybe a statement you made earlier. A couple of folks are laser focused in on some of the words you're sharing. I offered interventions I hoped they would not accept. So honest and tragic. Why don't clinicians do a better job of figuring out what to do about the emotional incursions from the job? We throw up mass vaccination sites, transplant life from one into another, but can't care for the caregiver asking for a friend.
Yep.
Why do I need control when it is not my uncertainty, but theirs? Where will we go from here together?
I think the question about how we don't have spaces to care for the caregiver is one that I very firmly believe we need to start addressing when people embark on their careers. And what that means is having real sessions, not one big lecture, but small group discussions with students who are everywhere from, nursing, pharmacy, social work, medicine. Anybody who's ever going to take care of a patient should be told from the beginning that this is not an easy job. And I don't want to beat you with the self-care stick when you're already in attending. I don't want to beat you at all, by the way, but I also want to help you to be prepared for the internal work of being a care provider in whatever form that takes. So much of what we're doing now is reactive. I think we need to be kind of proactive in helping people prepare for what they see and being honest about what they're going to see. Much of medicine is palliative in nature. There are things we can cure, but there's a lot of things we can't cure. And so really trying to make peace with that and prepare yourself for what it's going to mean to have to help people through things you cannot fix for them, like dementia or heart failure when they're never going to be a transplant candidate, end stage cancer. What does it mean to sit with that and to know that it's okay to feel what you feel, but where can we help you take those feelings?
So we do have one here, helpless, no. Mother is screaming, I want her to hold my hand. Desperate, blue lips and bruises, cold and still, so very small, tucking in blankets, wrapped like a baby swaddled, tenderness.
That is beautiful. Beautiful and raw and uncensored.
We have a couple of others here. I guess somebody may be commenting from your book. You write, my work in the borderland between life and death has shown me how we, doctors, patients, families, talk around rather than about suffering, dignity, living and dying. How can we bring the borderland into our environs?
Great question. I'm of the opinion that the borderland is never far away from where we are, because that borderland it can show up out of nowhere. You can be going along your path in life and get hit by a car and suddenly there's the borderland. And so I think part of what I have had to do in medicine, what I wish I had a better sense of when I was in training, is again, making peace, not just as a physician, but as a human being, that I think as the Christians say, within life, we are amidst death. I'm probably butchering it, but that concept that we are all impermanent and no one knows when something's going to happen that's very unexpected. And so shifting our focus to reminding ourselves that we don't know where we are in relation to that borderland. So how can we live as human beings with that in mind? And then how can we help our patients to adopt that perspective and have discussions about what makes their life meaningful and prioritizing that, no matter where they are in their lives.
All right, a couple more here if you'd like. It's all and always bleak. What is a positive outcome? We never see it. We find satisfaction in the strangest places. Someone wants to go on hospice. A patient believes in the afterlife. I feel these are tricks of light. Nothing good ever happens to our patients. What possible self-talk or self-compassion can truly address this? Someone obviously struggling meaningfully with their practice and these themes.
And I think that's a great question. What is a good outcome? And how is that relative? Is it a bad thing if our patients go on hospice? Could that actually be the best outcome for them or the best exercise of their agency? Could it mean, again, kind of shifting the idea of what it means to help in a bad situation? And in palliative care, I am often called in late when a bunch of bad conversations have taken place, and now I'm asked essentially to clean up the mess. And even finding some sort of meaning in that, where the outcome that I would define as good, meaning helping to get the patient out of the hospital, if that's not possible, then how can I help in the other ways that are possible and open to this person? But acknowledging that it does wear on you. And being around death, and even death aside, just the suffering and the burden of that emotionally and energetically and spiritually, that's something where finding meaning in that is a lot harder. And I would say that's kind of the biggest challenge I've faced as someone in that position.
Thank you. I believe somebody is teeing up some of your prior words in a helpful manner here by saying it is in the lack of resolution that beauty exists. Wow, this is powerful. Can you say more?
So I think that is something that as a writer and as a reader, I think a lot about. And I read a book recently that I also highly recommend called The Friend by Sigrid Nunez, and it's fiction. And it's a beautiful example of of lack of resolution, but it's not the resolution that captures you, it's the search for it in the book. And that's really where on that search that we can find what is beautiful about our own process and moving towards in that process, embracing that you may never have the resolution you have in mind, but there is some sort of resolution that happens spiritually along the way in that search. And I think good writing is always about that. It will never promise you an answer. It will promise you a journey and a look in the interior of someone who is struggling, which in the end of the day is all of us.
Well, mindful of time, I want to tee up maybe as I did this morning in Medical Grand Rounds with a couple of lines from your book, which I really enjoyed, which I think you're closing out maybe your introduction or one of your preface with the following. My hope is that the stories of my patients, colleagues, and family may free us all to acknowledge that a deeper understanding and embrace of our own mortality may actually revitalize how we live and what we consider to be most meaningful in each of our brief lives. Would you like to follow that up in any way?
Yes, I think so. Before I do that, I do just want to bring it full circle and briefly read what I ended up writing as my paragraph when I took myself through the same exercise. 2 hours later, my hands compressed his chest, blood spurted out of the tube connecting him to a ventilator, and I was doing everything to him but nothing for him. The code was bloody, long, and suddenly over. I've blamed myself for so long for how he died in his own blood and shit, utterly alone. I've carried the guilt and the grief for so long, but how has it helped me? Has it made me a better doctor? Has it made me a better person? What do I do with the anger and depression and self-hatred? all of it was my way of grieving, and I had nowhere to put those feelings. So today I'm going to bury a flower in the ground for him and forgive myself finally. I think the sentences you read are really ultimately speaking to the process we're talking about here, that life is going to happen to us in our work and in our personal lives. And I think the journey is really in the quest to make your life what you want it to be in the best possible way, but also to know that making the best of life means understanding that we are impermanent and that this is a life in which we've been given time to experience these hard things, but to find some modicum of meaning in them and to let it teach you something. And so I think being a student of life means finding a way to process what you go through, whether it's writing or anything else, so that you can truly understand what's happening within you. And I do think that writing or art in other forms is very different from something like a support group or therapy, because there you're with another person, and on a page you can really just be with yourself and see that process of seeking resolution play itself out. And I think I have one last slide, maybe with my contact info on it. Oh, never mind. Okay, so I think, is there anything beyond the next slide? There we go. Any other questions or thoughts?
Well, I see Nick in the room, perhaps ready to thank you for your time with us. I think from the Q&A field, we're all good here, but thanks, Dr. Puri, and back to you, Nick.
Thanks, Kevin, and thank you, Dr. Puri. As I said in the thread there, I so appreciate your wisdom and vulnerability in guiding us through this conversation and introducing us to this reflective praxis that enriches the healing arts. And may we heed your wise words and carry forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real honor to be with all of you today.